Hello and welcome to the Port of Los Angeles February Media Briefing. We're proud to kick off our 7th year of these monthly briefings, a forum we created to provide real-time insights on cargo trends and what they mean for global trade. I'm Philip Sanfield, the Port's Communications Director. With me, as always, is Executive Director Gene Seroka. Good morning, Gene.
Hello, Philip, and here we are, right out of the gates on a shortened work week following the President's Day holiday. And specially, Happy New Year to everyone. Happy Lunar New Year. Today marks the 2-week celebration of the Year of the Fire Horse. 新年快乐，我的朋友们. To our friends and Asia partners and all around the world, we wish you a joyful time of tradition, family, and renewal. It's also Black History Month. While the contributions of Black Americans deserve recognition year-round, this month serves as a focused time to celebrate the resilience, achievements, and profound ways they continue to shape our communities and our industry. Both these observances remind us that our port is built on the strength of diverse communities and global connections, values that guide our work every single day. Now, let's turn to our agenda. We'll start with January's cargo numbers, our first snapshot of 2026. Following that, we'll be joined by Chad Bown, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute and a leading authority on U.S. trade policy. Chad will help us frame the current trade landscape, including what to watch for now and in the months ahead. Then we'll open up for your questions. Before we dive into the numbers, I want to thank everyone who joined us in person and via live stream for our 11th annual State of the Port last month. We brought together more than 920 industry and community leaders at AltaSea, our hub for ocean-based innovation and education. At this unique waterfront venue, we shared a special afternoon that began by honoring the first responders who battled last November's container ship fire. We then outlined our vision for building bigger, smarter, and more sustainably. That includes plans for the first new container terminal in a generation, major infrastructure upgrades, along with continued investment in technology and efficiency. We announced our 2025 cargo results, 10.2 million container units. It was our third busiest year on record and marked the 26th consecutive year that Los Angeles was the busiest port in the Western Hemisphere. We also showcased our continued progress along the LA waterfront, from this summer's planned opening of West Harbor, a major retail and entertainment center, to our new Outer Harbor cruise terminal to support LA's growing industry. And finally, we spotlighted the ongoing zero-emission work happening today here at the Port of Los Angeles. So thank you to the many journalists who covered this event and helped us share our story.
Thanks, Gene. The feedback from State of the Port has been outstanding. Now let's turn to the latest data and what trends you're seeing as we start the year.
Philip, January came in as expected. We processed 812,000 20-foot equivalent units, down about 12% from last year and 3% below our 5-year average for the month. There are several factors at play here. First, we're comparing against elevated 2025 numbers when importers were scrambling to get cargo in ahead of tariffs. We'll be seeing these high year-over-year comps through much of 2026. Second, inventories remain slightly higher nationwide, reflecting the earlier cargo surge and a more cautious restocking pace. Finally, U.S. trade policy remains largely uncertain, and I expect that to continue. With this context, let's break down the numbers. January imports landed at 421,000 container units, down 13% from last year's higher levels, yet only 3% off our 5-year average. With the Consumer Confidence Index now at its lowest point in 11 years, everyone from Wall Street to Main Street to my street is paying attention. On the export side, we handled 104,000 container units, an 8% drop year over year. That's our lowest monthly output in almost 3 years. This reinforces why trade policy is so important. American farmers and manufacturers need to remain competitive in global markets. They simply can't afford to lose more ground. Lastly, empty containers came in at 286,000 TEUs, a 12% drop from last year. That reflects softer demand ahead in Asia for containers making the return trip across the Pacific. The bottom line, January held no surprises. We're facing high year-over-year comps, ongoing uncertainty around the economy, and trade policy. While February arrivals look relatively flat compared to last year, we'll see the traditional post-Lunar New Year slowdown hit us in March. All that to say, compared to last year's big first quarter, I project a decline of less than 10% for Q1. And I don't see the economy or cargo volume dropping off a cliff after that. And even though holiday sales were softer than we would have liked, I don't see a dire situation. For instance, I watch purchase orders that go out 3 months in advance to Asia factories, and right now they're looking stable. That's a good sign. Meanwhile, here in Los Angeles, we're continuing to plan, invest, and build through cycle, so we're ready as soon as the cargo picks up.
Thank you, Gene. You've raised a few issues that our next guest specializes in. Would you please introduce him?
My pleasure, Philip. Chad Bown is from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Chad has spent much of his career studying how tariffs, trade enforcement, and retaliation affect costs, supply chains, and global commerce. He's also co-author of the forthcoming book, How to Win a Trade War, scheduled for release by Simon & Schuster this spring. Chad, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start off by setting the stage. How would you describe the current trade environment for U.S. importers and exporters, and what's keeping everyone focused on this?
Well, I think you put it perfectly in your opening when you said uncertainty. So when we compare ourselves today to where we were a year ago, we were 1 month into the new Trump administration's tenure. And by then, so by February of 2025, so far, all we'd had was the president imposing 10% tariffs on China. And as we saw over the rest of the year, that's not where things ended. We had lots more tariffs on China. We had a retaliation by China. We had tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And then we had the Liberation Day tariffs on the rest of the world, too. So that led to a lot of activity, more activity on the tariff side than we have seen probably since the Second World War in the 1930s. And while things calmed down over the second half of the year, as the president and his team was out negotiating deals, we also know that this president is one that tends to like to use tariffs for each and any possible reason that you could come up with, oftentimes having nothing to do with trade. So when it comes to trade policy, there's just a lot of uncertainty out there, and it's watching every moment for something to possibly change.
Well put. Chad, can you talk about timing a little bit? Because even for the most seasoned professional in this industry, it's kind of murky. When tariffs go into effect, some people thought prices would go up right away, but we've also seen other impacts around the job market, investment. How do we pull all this together so the average person can understand what's going on?
So it's still something that even economists are trying to figure out. But I can tell you what we know so far. And there's a couple of very good research studies that have come out in just the last few weeks that have dived exactly into this question. And so what we know so far is the tariffs that the United States, the Trump administration applied last year. So far, the burden of those tariffs are almost entirely being borne by Americans. So that means if you impose a 25% tariff on a good coming in, the effect of that 25% is being paid by someone in the United States. It doesn't always feed through into end prices to consumers. Sometimes it's companies simply deciding to do things differently. Maybe they're going to eat it in terms of accepting lower profits. Maybe they decide to bring in less stuff. But the evidence so far, at least through, say, the first 8 or 9 months of 2025, is that almost 100% of the tariffs are being paid by somebody in the United States. But it is somewhat surprising that we haven't seen a bigger impact on consumer prices. We have seen some impact. But again, these things kind of take time. As you mentioned, businesses had built up a lot of inventory in anticipating the coming tariffs last spring. So that's one contributing explanation. There were a lot of tariff exemptions that the administration announced along the way, making sure that some products weren't ultimately going to be hit. And then also, I think companies managed to source from different places to be able to avoid some of those tariffs too, as a mitigation strategy. But at the end of the day, I think it's a really good question. It's still one that we're very uncertain about as researchers and economists, and I think one that we'll be studying for a while.
And what leadership is telling me in the private sector companies, C-suite, CEOs, is that, okay, look, I'm trying to do everything I can, but looking forward any more than 6 months is futile in many cases because I just don't know where all this policy is going to land. What are top executives telling you right now about what their point of vision is going out for the next quarter, 2, or through the end of this year?
It's exactly that. And I think it's impacting some of their longer term investment decisions. Some were better positioned, I think, to respond to the administration's tariffs this time around, and had set up alternative supplier bases. That when the tariffs went on China, for example, last year, if you had a China +1 strategy enacted after the first Trump administration and you'd set up assembly facilities somewhere else, you were quickly able to pivot and be able to source from those places instead. But nowadays, I think executives that are trying to make the forward-looking decisions about how to respond, where to make those next investments to be able to react appropriately should policy change, they don't know. And they're still very much affected by the uncertainty of what the future of this administration's trade policy is ultimately going to look like.
Right. And then the second part of the conversation I have is with leadership across a variety of industries. Okay, GDP is moving along okay. The job market is soft, but not horrible. Job openings are a little bit low right now in the 6+ million territory. And inflation is not of the runaway variety. But what could all this have been taking out this equation of the ups and downs of tariffs and threats and implementation and walkbacks? Where could we be right now?
Well, I think that's right. I think, some of the tariffs you can motivate as potentially being important parts of U.S. government policy for national security resilience, perhaps supply chain resilience types of reasons. But a lot of them don't necessarily make a whole lot of economic sense. They generate incredible uncertainty for businesses. The companies and their employees have to spend so much time running around trying to figure out how to source something differently, what the latest policies are, how they're being adjusted. Oftentimes these policies are announced as one thing and then they're adjusted a couple of days later, and everybody has to re-go do their homework again. And that's just taking time and energy, I think, away from companies being able to focus on what it is that they want to do best, which is to create new products to satisfy their customers and to make sure that they're happy. So it definitely, I think, is a world in which without these tariffs, companies would be having better things to do with their time.
And on that focus with respect to time, what should CEOs be watching for this year on the trade landscape? Any surprises, any tripwires out there for folks to really pay attention to?
Well, I think there's at least 2 major items over the next couple of months, maybe 3, that folks should be watching out for. First, obviously, is this Supreme Court decision that has challenged some of the administration's across the board tariffs that were imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. We don't know when the Supreme Court is going to make that decision, but that's sort of the first thing to watch out for, because if they were to throw out those tariffs, that could lead to, in some sense, a whole lot of chaos. So that's the first one. The second is probably the anticipated meeting that President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping are supposed to have perhaps as early as April. In the past, when President Trump and Xi got together, there tended to be deals. And so that's what folks are waiting for this time. Is there going to be some sort of new deal that might alter the trajectory of both U.S. trade policy, but also potentially Chinese trade policy as well? And then the third, and this one is more legislated, is we have upcoming this summer the review of the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the free trade agreement between the three major economies of North America. This is something that has to take place under the terms of the agreement starting in July, but we'll see what the administration's priorities are going to be for review. Do they want to keep it as is? They have suggested no, but they haven't really articulated what it is that they want to see changed about the agreement. In President Trump's first term, renegotiating what was then the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was a huge priority. It created a lot of political rancor, especially between the United States and Canada and Mexico as well. We've had a lot of friction with Canada in the first year of this administration. So I think watching how all of that plays out over the course of 2026 is going to be important too.
Excellent highlights, Chad. Thanks. And lastly, from my side, you've got a new book coming out. And I have to ask, because the title is How to Win a Trade War. Without giving away too much, what's the short answer?
Well, unfortunately, the short answer isn't just choose not to play, because that has not been allowed in the current environment. Unfortunately, everybody is being forced to play some sort of role in this trade war. So what I'll tell you is essentially this. The way we thought about it is there's something for everyone that's now being forced to engage in this trade war to learn from the other teams. So if you think about it as maybe you're an American, maybe you're a government, maybe you're a company, you're thinking about the other teams out there. Maybe they're the Chinese government or some other company or voters, right? What is it that you can learn from the opposing players? Maybe if it's the Chinese government, you learn about how their policies work. What do we have that we can learn from them that might improve how we do things here in the United States, or better understand how they're doing things there in China, whether it's tariffs, subsidies, export restrictions, or even things like stockpiling? We go through it all in the book. We try to make it fun and lively and try to translate the trade nerd world to a broader audience. And yeah, it'll be out in the spring.
That is fantastic. And for a long time, whether it be trade or supply chain, we've kind of flown under the radar. And so great to see that you'll be opening that up to your readers as well. Really super. Philip, back over to you. I know we've got a bunch of questions to the media. Super good start, Chad. Thanks.
Thank you, Gene. Yes, we do have a lot of questions. We've taken many in advance, and if anyone would like to ask one now, please use the Q&A box below and include your name and outlet. So let's start with a question for Chad from Lisa Bartline of Reuters. Chad, there's been speculation that the administration's tax changes this year will give Americans a larger refund. Do you expect a bump in spending if this occurs, and could it mask the impact of tariffs?
It's a great question. It could lead to a bump in spending. There have also been discussions over the course of 2025, if we think back, of Americans potentially receiving dividends from all the tariff revenue that's been collected, right? So we'll have to wait and see to what extent any of these policy shifts might play out. What we tend to know is from the data is that it depends on who it is that's going to be getting the income, right? And if the income is primarily going to, or the new funds are primarily going to lower income households, then yeah, they do tend to spend more on goods and oftentimes more on imported goods than other people out there in the economy. So in theory, yep, it could actually end up potentially affecting the trade numbers in some ways as well. But we'll have to wait and see as to how the numbers actually shake out.
Thank you, Chad. The next question is for Gene from Lorianne Larocco of CNBC. What are exports to China looking like, and did you see an uptick after the November agreement?
Thanks for joining again this month, Lorianne. And exports to China look dismal. Overall, they've dropped considerably across the country, and right here at the Port of Los Angeles is just one barometer of our international trade. U.S. containerized exports to China down 26% last year, although the Port of Los Angeles was relatively flat. Overall, the biggest hit was on the soybeans, the agricultural export commodity, and it's a really important part of the overall export strategy here. Soybeans coming out of the Port of Los Angeles to China were down 80% last year, with no improvement seen in either November or December after those discussions on the sidelines of APEC between China and U.S. leadership. For soybean exports overall out of the U.S. to China, last year showed a decline of 90%. And as we've reported here before, Argentina, Brazil have picked up a lot of the contracts for China on soybeans, and these are not transactional type applications. These are agreements that'll last 3, 6, 12 months in duration, so it'll be yet another cycle before the U.S. soybean exporter has a chance to bid and get into the game. Thanks, Lorianne.
Gene, Lorianne has a follow-up for you. What kind of increase have you seen from other countries in Asia to offset declines from China?
You know, it's been interesting, Lorianne, since 2018, when the first trade policy and tariffs specifically targeting China came into the American vernacular, we had about 60% of our import business tied to China here at the Port of Los Angeles. Today, it's 40% and dropping, yet we've still grown. And it's been the Southeast Asia component of countries that have seen these gains. But again, you're not going to replace China or even one province in China with another origin. But Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines combined last year moved an incremental 200,000 container units, and that outstripped the declines that we saw from China. Now, there are ups and downs with each country that we trade with. Overall, we came in to close out 2025 just about a percentage point behind the volume of 2024. So all in all, our third best year ever, third time we've crossed that real psychological goalpost of 10 million container units, and no other port in the United States has ever done that once. So pretty good year, but a lot of ups and downs, a lot of fits and starts. And it really spelled out how resilient we were as a supply chain. The dock workers, truckers, warehouse folks really answering the bell. Even with, as we go back to last year, announcements that come out, importers slamming on the brakes because the tariffs were too high. When those negotiations changed and tariffs were reduced, cargo volume really shot up. So up and down year, but all in all, we moved the third most cargo that we ever have, and not one ship was backed up. Thanks, Lorianne.
Thank you, Gene. Back to Chad. This question is from Laura Curtis of Bloomberg. Are Chinese suppliers lowering prices to U.S. buyers? And if so, to what degree to absorb some of the costs of tariffs? And is that happening in some sectors more than others?
It's a great question, and it goes back to the evidence that I was talking about earlier on who's bearing the burden of the tariffs that have been imposed so far and what we're seeing of that in the evidence. And the answer is essentially no. We haven't seen any evidence yet that the Chinese exporters are actually lowering their prices to stay in the U.S. market. To the extent that sales continue, it's basically being borne by somebody on the American side, but oftentimes the sales aren't continuing. Right, they're just getting cut off, and there's a lot of potential transactions out there that, because of the tariffs, are no longer profitable, and so the two sides say we're just not going to do it. I wanted to add one thing to what Gene just said, and I agree with his take on the data entirely. The one other item that I had noticed looking at the U.S. import data for 2025 is the surprising amount of imports that have been shifting toward Taiwan, right? So yes, it's a lot of stuff coming in from Vietnam that may be consumer electronics, that may be clothing, footwear, furniture even. But what we're really seeing come out of Taiwan, I think, is what I call infrastructure related to the artificial intelligence boom. right? The computer chips, the printed circuit boards, right? The stuff that you need to build out those data centers in the United States, right? That's another big piece of this story that I think has helped trade hold up quite substantially in 2025.
Great. Thank you both for that answer. Gene, this is Laura Curtis following up for you. Customs and Border Patrol says it's ramping up investigations and enforcement of trade fraud. Are you seeing a higher rate of containers flagged, inspected, or detained here in Los Angeles?
Thanks for joining, Laura. No, I haven't seen any unusual activity, and CBP usually doesn't telegraph what they're doing strategically or tactically so they can get after the bad guys. But looking at the daily stats of the port, the dwell time for cargo moving in and out by truck is below 3 days now, and that's better than it was pre-COVID. So the velocity of cargo moving in and out is really good. The truck wait times at both ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles are right at about an hour or less. We're going to continue to chip away, but here again, best in 5 or 6 years. So realistically speaking, that cargo velocity is good. If CBP is working on some things, they'll probably do so within a very confined area of knowledge and make sure that they're enforcing the rules and regulations of the United States. Thanks, Laura.
Chad, we've gotten a few questions on the pending Supreme Court case, which you referred to earlier. Without trying to predict the outcome, what are the key issues the justices are weighing, and what should we be watching most closely?
Well, as a non-lawyer, even though I do sometimes play one on a podcast, I probably shouldn't speculate as to how the justices are thinking about this and what it is that they're weighing. But I can tell you about what it is that I'm looking for. And that is essentially the administration, the U.S. administration has said, even if the Supreme Court rules against their tariffs, they have other statutes lined up to be able to apply tariffs some other way. So one question for the justices would be, will they send signals about when using those other statutes would be appropriate and when they would not be appropriate? So that would be the first thing that I would be looking for. The second would be, if they do rule against the tariffs, there's also the possibility and likelihood that all of the tariff revenue that was collected last year, and we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars of that, would need to be refunded to the American public, right? To the importers, to the consumer somehow, that were the ones paying this. How is that going to work? Right? We've never done something like that before. So in any case, there's a lot of real world implications for if the Supreme Court rules against the administration's tariffs, what happens after that? The lawyers that I've talked to have basically said, buckle up. There could be a period of chaos, another period of chaos, if you will.
Thank you. Gene, question from Bill Mongaluzzo, Journal of Commerce. Is there anything to indicate that after a slow first half of 2026 predicted, container volumes pick up in the second half?
Good to hear from you as always, Bill. Don't know. Again, that horizon of planning that CEOs have talked about, the American Association of Supply Chain Management did a recent survey as well, is about 6 months. And anything longer than that, a little bit jaded view, but it's like it's worthless because if something comes out or another policy change, here we go again. So again, putting all this into context, we'll be above that psychological 800,000 TEU threshold in both January and February leading up to Lunar New Year, which starts today, but all those vessels just left Asia. So they'll be landing here towards the end of the month, first week of March, and after that, that's when we'll see a little bit of a dip. But not bad, even compared to the 5-year running average. And while Lunar New Year shifts every year, for the first quarter, I don't think it's going to be down as much as some pundits have said it would. So realistically speaking, again, GDP is okay. Jobs are moving along. Inflation is not too out of hand right now. By and large, pretty steady so far. Purchase orders are not being canceled right now, which is something we've witnessed in other years that were much more bumpy from an economic output standpoint. So realistically speaking, we'll go through the traditional seasonality this year, pre-Lunar New Year, then some spring fashion, summer fashion, gearing up for back to school, Halloween, and mixed into that will be everybody's look at what the holiday season brings as far as imports. Much more to come. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Gene. This next question just came in for Chad from Oliver Ward, a trade reporter at AgriPulse. China's left some retaliatory tariffs in place on U.S. exports. Do you know who is mostly footing the bill for those? Is it the Chinese buyers, or are U.S. exporters eating those costs?
Great question, Oliver. So just going back to Gene's earlier point, for the most part, U.S. exporters aren't shipping to China. And Gene mentioned soybeans. That was one example. But if you look across the board, there's not much that the United States is exporting to China these days, whether it's manufacturing, agriculture beyond soybeans, beef, cotton, wheat, corn, all of that was down in 2025 as well. Energy products, right? Crude oil, LNG, coal, all those shipments were down too. And so if there's no volume, right, then it's sort of the question about who's bearing the incidence disappears. So it's a great question. Unfortunately, we haven't yet seen any studies on the Chinese side to know how the tariffs are being, who's paying the effective tariffs on their side. But I think the headline is effectively what Gene said, is that the United States exporters trying to send their stuff to China these days are just really, really, really struggling.
Great. Thank you so much, Chad. Gene, this question is for you from Stuart Churls of FreightWaves. What's your reaction to the White House Maritime Action Plan released Friday that calls for fees on imports carried on foreign-built ships to help build American shipbuilding?
Thanks for the question, Stuart. My reaction is that we need more details and more information. But this is a little bit of a shift, and basically we could call this industrial policy versus the first go-around with the U.S. Trade Representative on trade policy. We don't know exactly what the formulaic approach will be, what the game plan is. But as we said with the first trade policy on ship fees, in an effort to help rebuild the shipbuilding industry in the United States, while admirable, this is a decades-long approach and a complete shift. We need a sector-specific review of outputs and inputs. Think of tiered suppliers and information. Second, we also need a very clear assessment on the workforce, how to attract, recruit, retain, what training they need. And according to the National Association of Manufacturers in Washington, D.C., we have more than 400,000 manufacturing jobs open in the country today. Where do we find the workforce? And then thirdly, and specifically, where would we put all these locations together from a geographical perspective? How do we take advantage of the strong infrastructure we have at our nation's seaports, at our airports, using rail connectivity to move these products around in order to help build ships? And realistically speaking, for me, as an international business person, after working overseas for 11 years, I can say, where do the economics play out? A container ship built in the United States is upwards of 6 times the cost of one built in some of the Asia locations like Japan, Korea, China, just to name a few. So there's a lot to be done here and a lot to study. But again, if we want to bring more jobs and more competitiveness to the shipping industry, we're all for it. Just got to see the details and have some engagement with experts in this arena.
Thank you, Gene. This appears to be our last question, unless someone else would like to drop one into the Q&A box here shortly. Chad, it's for you. Beyond tariffs, what other trade issues are shaping global commerce now?
That's a great question. And I think nowadays what we're seeing that it's very, very different from the first Trump administration of 2018, 2019 especially, is there's a lot of other non-tariff stuff that's happening. Right. And so one of the big, differences last year in particular, what really brought the administration back down to earth when it came to their tariffs on China was not China's retaliatory tariffs, but it was China's export restrictions on permanent magnets and rare earths, right? Those basically shut off the ability of American automakers to get access to certain parts that they needed. They can do that. China can do that because they dominate certain supply chains, right? They are the world's largest producer. They have 90-something% of the world's processing facilities for rare earths. They make a lot of the world's, 85% of the world's permanent magnets. They're dominant in other critical minerals as well. Other countries, the United States, I think perhaps one of the most positive signals that we've seen over the last couple of weeks is the administration announcing that it has a cooperative plan to begin to work with the European Union and Japan, as well as separately with Mexico on this critical minerals sourcing type of issue. So I think that's what I'll be watching in 2026. Aside from tariffs, what is the progress of the United States and other countries in breaking China's dominance in some of these key supply chains, whether it's critical minerals, rare earths, permanent magnets, or low-end semiconductors? There will be lots out there to watch, even aside from tariffs.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. We did get one more question in from our friend Sue at ABC News. She's asking Chad and Jean, we'll start with Chad. What are you seeing in terms of price increases? CEOs have been warning that prices will go up now as they begin to get passed on to consumers. Are we seeing anything in your data sets that are showing those trends? So Chad, let's start with you.
Yeah, and so I think we did see some price increases happen toward especially the tail end of 2025. I think we're still waiting on what the impacts are going to be in the 2026 numbers. A lot of this work is coming from not necessarily the government sources. We have to remember that there was a government shutdown for many, many weeks in the fall that led to delays in the availability in some of the government statistics that we would normally use to be able to examine these things. But some of the private experts out there that have begun to look at them have found, yeah, there is evidence that these tariffs are impacting prices. It's not leading to runaway inflation by any stretch, but it is making prices higher than they would otherwise have been. And that's definitely something that we're going to keep continuing to track, especially as some of these tariffs that were gone on inputs, if we're talking steel and aluminum and all the things that companies buy, finally work their way through supply chains and end up at America's consumers.
Thank you, Chad. Over to Jean for any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Sue, for the question. A number of outlets have reported their own studies on pricing, as Chad alluded to. And, bananas and coffee, which are not going to come here to the United States for growing an agriculture sector to take on. Both of those products are up 10% year over year. Footwear and furniture, same here. And then a little bit closer to home, as I've talked about regularly, following the terrible wildfires 13 months ago here in Los Angeles, trying to rebuild homes and businesses and parts of the communities in Malibu, Pacific Palisades, and Altadena. We've seen experts in the building area, building and trades, architecture firms, construction companies, all say the prices of softwood lumber, metals, appliances, and just about everything it takes to go into a home is much more expensive than it was last year. As unscientific as that sounds, these are the people on the ground trying to rebuild 17,000 structures that were decimated due to those wildfires. So safe to say, tariffs have had a direct impact on price. Thanks, Sue.
Well, thank you both for those answers. Jean, that does conclude the media questions. I'll turn it back to you for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Philip. Chad, this was great. Really appreciate your expertise in putting this out there in a framework that folks can understand. And best of luck on the book debut coming up this spring. Really great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Finally, I'd like to finish by spotlighting one of our terminal partners here at the Port of Los Angeles, SSA Marine. While SSA operates terminals around the world, their facility here in LA is unique in two ways. First, it's the specialized work they do here. For more than 4 decades, SSA Marine at Berth 55 has simply been known as the Fruit Dock. This operation is exclusively dedicated to getting fresh fruit to grocers, markets, and distribution centers during the winter when the fruit growing season here in the U.S. is on hiatus. SSA has become a central processing hub for Chilean fruit, destined for dining tables from the West Coast to Texas and up to the Canadian border. This winter season, the terminal will handle approximately 85,000 metric tons of Chilean fruit, everything from grapes to stone fruit like peaches, nectarines, and plums. SSA Marine is specifically designed for palletized cold storage shipments for refrigerated cargo ships, a method that protects against bruising while maintaining airflow and temperature control. In fact, we're the only West Coast port with this type of specialized terminal. And here's the second thing that makes this terminal stand out: its commitment to sustainable operations. Last spring, SSA Marine became the first terminal at our port to fully transition to 100% zero-emission cargo handling equipment. They converted all 44 of their forklifts from propane to human-operated battery electric vehicles. That's quite an achievement. And it was the first of all the SSA Marine terminals worldwide to reach this milestone. We're so proud they chose our port to lead the way. Our appreciation goes out to Claudio Biazovich and the entire SSA team right here in Los Angeles for all they do to ensure continuity of the fresh fruit to American consumer market continues to flourish, and for their unwavering commitment to sustainable operations right here at home. Thank you all for joining us again today, and we look forward to seeing you back here again in March.